Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Get Ready for Game Night, my YouTube channel where I try to teach you how to play some of my favorite games in a casual, unscripted way, just as though you're sitting down at the table with me. Tonight, by far, my most requested teach of all time, I'm going to be teaching you how to play Warriors of Middle-earth, the expansion to War of the Ring. So let's get ready for game night. A few little housekeeping tidbits first. I'm going to assume you know how to play War of the Ring before you watch this video. If you don't, I will put a link to my instructional video on how to play War of the Ring below. Number two, I am trying out a brand new microphone. I would greatly appreciate it if you would leave comments telling me how the new microphone sounds. And finally, if I make any errors during this teach and I don't catch them until after I've published this to YouTube, well, turn on the Klingon subtitles. I will correct any goofs I make after I've posted it using the Klingon subtitles. So let's get going. So the main thing that Warriors of Middle-earth is going to add to the War of the Ring is this idea of factions. There are now additional sort of sub-armies that can help each of the players, mostly during combat. Warriors of Middle-earth definitely pushes you more toward the combat end of things, but also adds some really cool wrinkles during combat. Let's go over what comes in the box. First of all, each player is going to get a set of miniatures to represent the new factions that can be recruited. There are 3 factions for each player, and each faction has its own miniature type. In addition to the miniatures, each player will get a faction reference card. These reference cards are double-sided. On the front side that has the picture, it tells you how to put factions into play, and on the back side it tells you the way that faction plays. Additionally, each faction has a set of cards called the Call to Battle cards. Now, if you look on the opposite side of these cards, you'll see that they look exactly like event cards that potentially could be played during battle. And that's when these cards are played. If a faction is either involved in the battle or close enough to be involved in the battle, based on their rules, these cards will come into play for that battle. Other cards that come into play are the fact that certain event cards are going to be replaced from the base game. If you look in the lower right-hand corner of these event cards, you'll see there's a tiny little asterisk next to the number of the card. You'll have to find those corresponding cards in the regular event decks and remove them. Each player will have a brand new event deck to play with. In addition to the strategy event deck and the character event deck, each player will now have a faction event deck. And as you can imagine, most of the text on these cards have to do with the factions. Also included in the Warriors of Middle-earth is a brand new reference chart that is really handy, because on the front it tells you what the faction die results will do. In the middle section it tells you what the regular action die does, and on the back it tells you about the Lords of Middle-earth dice. Dice. As soon as either player gets one of their factions into play, they will get to roll a new die during the die roll phase of their turn. The green die is for the Free People's player, and the yellow die is for the Shadow. There is a new term that is introduced in this game because the term shows up on some of the new event cards, and that term is Unconquered. What Unconquered means is that whichever player controlled an area at the start of the game, if they still control it right now, it is considered unconquered. Basically, that just means you could lose an area to the opponent and then you get it back, and for the purposes of the cards, that area is still unconquered to you. So let's talk about these faction event cards and how they work. First of all, you are going to have a separate hand limit for the faction event cards. The regular event cards still have their normal hand limit of 6. However, you have a separate hand limit of 4 for the faction event cards. One key difference, however, is that if a faction event deck is ever drained and is completely empty, that deck is reshuffled, and that's different from the way the regular event decks play. Now, some of the cards in the faction event deck will allow you to recruit new members to your faction. However, if you were to play one of these cards that allows you to add a faction army, but you don't have that army in play yet, that's okay. You are allowed to play that card, and you would simply place that faction unit on that faction's reference card. If and when that faction is activated, then you would gain the normal starting troops for that faction in addition to any faction units that are on the card. So as I said, each player will receive a special faction die that they will get to roll starting with the turn after they activate one of their factions. As long as any of that player's factions are in play, they get to roll the faction die and spend that die as an action just like any other die in the game. So let's go over the dice in detail. The Free People's die has this little sun symbol on it, and that is their symbol to recruit. Using the recruit action, you can either bring another faction into play or bring more of the units of any faction into play that are already activated. The next symbol is this sort of double card symbol where you see a card going down and then two cards together. That just means you can either play or draw a faction event card. And finally, you see combinations of all those symbols. And whenever you see two symbols, that means you can do either or of those two actions. Switching over to the Shadow Player's die, their recruit faction icon looks like a menacing triangle. They have the same symbol for play and draw faction event cards. They have an Eye of Sauron, and if they ever roll an Eye of Sauron, it is put into the hunt box, just like any other die that has the Eye of Sauron on it. And finally, this symbol here, the little menacing triangle with the elvish script around the outside, that's a wild. That can be used as any other shadow faction die result. If you choose to make it an Eye of Sauron, it does immediately go into the hunt pool. Now, when you start a game of War of the Ring with Warriors of Middle-earth, it will be identical to a regular game, because all of the factions start out of play. So the way you bring factions into play is different for every single faction, and it's spelled out pretty clearly on the front side of every faction reference card. Basically, you have to use a muster result of your rolled dice, and then the condition on the card must be met. And honestly, the conditions are not that hard to meet. You will easily be able to get multiples of your factions into the game if you want to play that way. But for completeness, the Dead Men of Dunharrow requires that either Aragorn or Strider is either within one region of Erac or in Erac. Then you just use a muster die and bring them in. For the Eagles, the Fellowship's last known location just can't be Rivendell, or if Gandalf the White is in play. And for the Ents, if Saruman is in play and a companion or the Fellowship is in Fangorn, you can activate the Ents. Switching over to the Shadow Player, the Corsairs of Umbar, you just have to have the Southrons and Easterlings at war. For the Hillmen of Dunland, in the outskirts of Orthanc, you just have to get Saruman into play. And for those of Shelob, similar to the Eagles, you just need that the Fellowship's last known location is not Rivendell. What happens after you have activated a faction? Great question. Well, if you flip over the faction reference card, the very first thing that you'll see is Starting Setup on the left-hand column. That tells you where and how many of each faction figure you're going to place on the board. The next step down, you'll see the recruitment. What that means is if you use a muster or recruit die, where a new faction member will show up. If there's a stacking limit or restrictions, they'll be printed here. And finally, how you can use the Call to Battle cards. These will be very different for each faction, so make sure you pay attention to that. Also, there is a way for your opponent to get rid of your faction, or sometimes even you'll get rid of it yourself, and that's outlined at the bottom under Elimination. In the right-hand column, it will outline any special rules that apply to either movement or combat with the new factions. The faction figures in 3, 2, 1. So what exactly are these faction figures? Well, let's start with what they're not. These are not army units, and they should be kept separate from the other units when occupying the same region, because these guys never have any combat strength. They're not attacked by enemy units. They don't have the same movement restrictions because they can cross enemy borders. Where these guys are never affect the political track in any way. So it's hard to wrap your brain around, but these are not army units. So if you have a faction unit in an area and no army units, you do not have control of that area. These factions are kind of like wild sidebar people that don't actually answer to you. Similar, however, to army units, the Free People's player, once a faction unit is removed from the game, it cannot come back into play, whereas the Shadow faction units can come back into play as long as there's any plastic off the board. Each faction, however, is limited to a total of 8 faction units. So once you've recruited a faction or two, how are they going to help you? Well, the main way that they influence the game is in battle. If you have a faction that is either joined with an army that's involved in a battle, or they're close enough to the battle that they can be recruited, and you'll find that on the faction reference card under Call to Battle, that basically tells you when they can be involved in the battle, these Call to Battle cards will come into play. So if you have a faction that is involved in the battle, when you pick up your event cards to decide whether or not you're going to play an event card as part of the battle, you will pick up all of the faction Call to Battle cards of that faction and also put them in your hand. That's why their backsides of these cards look just like event cards, to disguise to your opponent whether or not you're going to be playing a regular event card for its bottom half action, or if you're going to be playing a Call to Battle card. Now, another key difference with these Call to Battle cards is that after you play them, they are not discarded. In fact, they go right back into your hand if there's another round of battle. So you could, in theory, play the same Call to Battle card for every single round of the combat, as long as there's at least one figure of that faction involved in the combat. Now at this point, you know everything you need to know to play Warriors of Middle-earth. So if you want to go enjoy a game of War of the Ring with Warriors of the Middle-earth, go have fun. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification button if you feel so inclined, and tell your friends about my channel. Send in requests, those kind of things keep me motivated to make more of these videos. Have fun with the game, and have fun at game night.